We're back on the Berserk train here, this time with a scripted chapter review because there's a lot to go through here and particularly a lot to speculate about, and the scripted review format is much better than the PowerPoint format for measured speculation, though I can't promise that all the speculation in this video will be entirely measured. Last chapter was all about characterization, so talking unscripted through the PowerPoint worked, but compiling my thoughts on everything we saw this chapter in a scripted format is the way we decided to go this time round. Next chapter, who knows what we'll do. But let's quit squabbling over the method of the chapter review and get into some actual chapter discussion. To start, we continue directly where we left off last chapter with Hannah, the dwarvish blacksmith and the creator of seemingly both the Berserker armor and Skull Knight's current metal outfit, smacking guts with a hammer, in order to teach him something about the armor. The end of the last chapter promised us some new information about the Berserker armor, but little did we know this would instigate a backstory 20 years in the making. But we're not quite there yet. The armor activates in reaction to Hannah's hammer strike, as we saw teased at the end of last chapter, and Guts goes erratic. Though Hannah has precautionary magical chains for this exact circumstance. Seemingly, he has everything under control. He acts as a calming presence early on in the chapter here. He knows more than we do and more than Guts does about his iconic armor, and he's decided to share some of his knowledge with us here, and then it happens. Perpetually everybody's jaws drop as Hannah monologues about unlocking a blood memory locked within the armor, about its previous wearer, and we get this ominous close-up panel of Skull Knight and we realize the thing is happening. After 20 plus years of Skull Knight existing and Mura teasing glimpses into the who, what, and the why of the bloke, we are finally getting some tangible insight, and holy shit, we were not ready. I could not fucking believe it was happening on my initial reading. I screamed, and it wouldn't be the last time this chapter. From here on out, the chapter is an implications game that will lead into a lot of speculation discussion, so strap yourselves in as we delve into the backstory of Skull Knight. The first glimpse we get of this blood memory is this double-page spread of this establishing shot of this ongoing possible proto-Bahamut sacrificial ceremony. A lot has been made by people that this ceremony looks remarkably different from the other sacrificial ceremonies we've seen in the story, and with the context clues later that this is probably a god-hand birthing ceremony, probably voids. It's particularly poignant that this ceremony seems so different from the eclipse. This has led people to believe that things worked differently 1,000 years ago, and this is some sort of old-fashioned proto-ceremony before they ironed out the kinks. One of the main differences is that there are no apostles around. For Griffith's ceremony, there was an army of apostles salivating in celebration. There's also no eclipse in the center of the vortex overhead, meaning that the eclipse element might have been unique to Griffith's ceremony too. But since we've only ever seen two, counting this ceremony, god-hand birthing events, it's hard to determine which one is the outlier. For all we know, this is how it usually looks, and the Griffith one was particularly important and therefore different. You just can't determine the norm with a sample size of 2. So I don't know if this is a proto-ceremony that's changed procedure in the last 1,000 years, or if it's just the same but different. One thing that seems to be consistent in all the birthing ceremonies we have seen, whether it be god-hand or apostle, is the reoccurring repeating visual motif element. We had cool Yu-Gi-Oh stairs before Yu-Gi-Oh had done it, with the count, then of course we had the faces with Griffith during the eclipse, and for this one we have terrifying tentacles, some with mouths and eyes on them. Visually, this page is magnificent. I almost don't need to say that. The framing of the entire blood memory being shown through Skull Knight's eyes, with this framing oval vision implicating his armor getting in the way of his vision, is great. And catering our visual focus on these 5 silhouetted figures in the center right, propped up on this tentacle platform, emitted from me the second verbal scream of my initial read-through. I knew that because of the 216-year thing that I was about to see some old god-hand designs, and I was ecstatic. And the silhouetted tease here to build the tension and anticipation is fantastic. Also, the importance of there being 5 of them was not lost on me, and it implicates this old Judo and Casca conversation from the Golden Age. There was a conflict between them as to how many angels were said to have descended to take down the evil King Geyserik. Judo says that there was 4, and then Casca says she had always heard that there was 5. This confusion stems from the fact, as we know from this chapter, that it was likely 4 that descended and 5 that ascended back to heaven after the battle. Down came 4, away went 5. But overall, this page is immaculate. The framing through Skull Knight's eyes allows the entire image to be off-kilter and have this slant, which obviously fits into everything being portrayed in this page. It's very off-putting. And the familiar summoning motifs of the God Hand, like the vortex and the silhouettes, makes the seasoned Berserk readers immediately understand what they are in for and the type of trauma to be expected in the coming pages. Then we get this double spread of maybe pseudo or proto-apostles appearing underneath the tentacles and maybe coming out of the tentacles' mouths. They also have mouths, so it's a little confusing. You can't entirely tell what's going on in this panel. The confusing horror of it all is supposed to get to you. But then as you get lower on the page, they start getting cut up, presumably by Geyserich in the armor, and there's a blood splatter in the final panel which helps frame the silhouette of the God Hand off in the distance that we still haven't been shown yet. This double spread looks great and also continues to build the anticipation for the reveal of what these ancient God Hand members looked like. I also thought originally that we were having a form is content moment where these panels were divided by the slashes of Geyserich's sword in the double spread, but the same visual motif is used later separating the Berserker armor on Geyserich and Guts, so I'm not too sure if that was actually what's happening. Also, the blood splatter might be Geyserich coughing up blood or something possibly. He could be in rough shape. Again, this blood memory is intentionally interpretive and that's why it's great. There's no dialogue to explain this shit. Make of it what you will. Visually, again, it's breathtaking and there's so much going on here that if you think about the artistry that went into it, your head will hurt and you might even get sympathy pains in your wrists. And then there they are, 4 new God Hand designs looking perfect, with a familiar prick in the center posing like a dickhead. This was my 3rd scream of the chapter. Did you ever think you would live to see this day? This is something collectively we've all dreamed about and thought about for years. What happened with Skull Knight and Void? What happened to the Ancient Kingdom? And what did the previous God Hand members look like? And we get insight into all these questions for the first time ever right here. But let's stay with the designs for a second. All these new God Hand designs, as I've already said, look perfect, but they also have design motifs that connect them to all the God Hand member designs we've had for the last 20 years, that canonically come after them, playing into the cyclical theme that this chapter has going on. The idea of evil clearly has cycles it goes through, and each succeeding God Hand member is similar to the ones that came before them. And besides this lore stuff, this works perfect visually because immediately upon seeing these new designs, they felt right. Before you even process that they have these similarities to the designs we're familiar with. But now being able to look at them having processed them since our initial scream-filled read-through, let's point out some of these similar design motifs. The lady looks enough like Slan, plus she's the only girl still, which makes her connection to Slan obvious, though I much prefer our Slan. Plus she's got the whole boob situation going on, connecting her to lust and sexuality. The mouth pussy guy looks just like Ubik. I could see that bloke pulling some shit like this. Their mouths even look similar. Plus he's a little guy too. And the little bloke who can't keep his mouth shut is reminiscent of Conrad and his weird mouth stuff. But the 4th one is most interesting because his overall design looks more like Ganishka than Femto, with the big beard and even in the face a little. But the connection to Femto is there also, in the texture on his chest. It's very similar to Femto's. And I don't want to alarm anybody or risk revisiting my old I Want Wings video, but his cape might be wings. Which, if we can reference back to that video for a second, changes everything if true. Griffith didn't want wings, he was destined to want wings. He wasn't granted his freedom when he was born as Femto, but let's not get into all of that right now, before we even know if Ganishka over here actually has wings. But texture is something visually that I really love from these designs, and their depiction in this double spread. It's something Miura excels at. They all have different skin or armor or whatever it is that covers their outer coat. Visually it's just so pleasing to look at. Also, the continued framing of us seeing through Geyserich's eyes works to the effectiveness of this page, as it puts the focus point for our eyes, which is Void, on a diagonal tilt, again making everything feel off kilter. The vortex being on the angle in the background and everything that's visually done with perspective to guide your eyes around the page, and then have you stare for a while and admire these designs is brilliant. The tentacles at the bottom, the framing here is spectacular. Berserk has great art, who knew? But this is an all-time panel. I stand by what I've said the last few chapter reviews, this is the best Berserk has ever looked. correct. But outside of the sheer visual girth of this page's penis, the story implications here are also interesting. Again, Berserk's history seems to be very cyclical, as it seems like the same type of God Hand members are reincarnated every cycle, as is implied with the reoccurring design motifs. But this also confirms that Void is the oldest amongst the contemporary God Hand members. The community headcanon was always that Void was the oldest and Slan was the youngest, which seems weirdly, interestingly, intrinsically sexist now that I think about it, but that's besides the point. Half of the community's assumptions at least was confirmed by this chapter. Void is the oldest. The chapter also seemed to confirm that Skull Knight and Void have this personal issue that's also been assumed in the community's headcanon since their initial clash at the eclipse. But now that we have these tiny bits of information, we can go back and analyze some of the desperate pieces of information Miura has given us over the years about the lore behind Berserk's world, like the story with the old man in the tower from the Tower of Conviction arc that's very likely confirmed to be Void at this point. Unless what we're seeing right now isn't Void's birthing ceremony, and he's the original God Hand member or something that even predates these guys we are meeting for the first time here. Maybe there isn't a personal connection between Geyserich and Void, and the Skull Knight fights the God Hand simply because they destroyed his kingdom and killed everybody he loved. Again, everything in this chapter is implied. Make of it and speculate as you will. The brands and the bodies at the bottom of the Torture Tower from the Golden Age and the woman in an upcoming double spread from this chapter lead me to believe that the personal connection angle is probably the more likely one. But any Void and Skull Knight additional information is much appreciated when we've been dying for more than just a look and a subtle fuck you for the last 20 years, so all of this was great. Void was there for the destruction of Geyserich's kingdom. Then we cut back to Guts in the present and he's freaking out at the sight of the God Hand. He noticed the extremely similar design motifs as well, and he is as mad as he would be if he saw the real God Hand. Guts even nearly breaks the magical anti-berserker armor chains and charges at Hannah, catching even him off guard. Guts in the armor is stronger than he expected, he even verbally comments on this. But before Guts can do any damage, he is stopped by being brought back into the blood memory at the sight of something familiar, and we get this beautiful parallel shot of Guts in the Berserker armor with his hands extended and Geyserich in the Berserker armor with his hands extended. With the key difference being that Geyserich is holding somebody in his arms who looks ostensibly like Griffith from behind, indicated by their hair texture. No one else has hair like this in Berserk, and Miura has trained us to think Griffith when seeing it, and it's why this was the third moment of the chapter that elicited a scream out of me. Before we even talk about the Griffith cyclical parallel stuff, this is a great opportunity for us to compare the two different Berserker armor designs as they are shown directly side by side here. Geyserich's resembles a skull and Guts's obviously represents the Hound entity, which itself is representative of Guts's internal, maybe eternal rage, by way of the eclipse. This page is just a really cool visual aid to show how the armor changes between the warriors who don it. Also, it's interestingly implied here that Geyserich utilized the armor before his encounter with the God Hand, before his equivalent of the Eclipse, before he has a comparable rage to Guts when he first wore it. Guts uses the armor as an outlet for his rage and trauma stemming from the Eclipse, but for Geyserich until this moment we are seeing right now, he just used it as a power increase without any rage or trauma fueling it seems. I wonder how the effectiveness of the armor differs in these different circumstances. Did Geyserich always have full control up until this point, or perhaps like Guts, he had been traumatized before his eclipse too? Hopefully we later get some insight into how Geyserich used the armor leading up to these events and how it functioned differently. Now let's talk about the cyclical implications with the Griffith-Girl here. I maybe assumed too quickly that this was a literal parallel. Maybe this girl just simply, coincidentally, has similar textured hair to Griffith. And you weren't supposed to scream when you first saw her from behind and assumed Geyserich was holding Griffith or his version of Griffith in this cycle. But I'm sure other people had that immediate reaction I did as well. So I just want to state before we delve too deeply into speculation about this supposed Griffith parallel here, that I could be off on this. And if so, you can disregard all the speculation built on this foundation. The next page, as we just alluded to, is a double-page spread revealing that the Griffith parallel we just saw from behind is in fact a girl, with the implication being that she's likely Geyserich's queen, or at least his lover. Now, a female Griffith will make more savvy Berserk readers think of the Prototype chapter where Guts saves a female character that resembles Griffith quite closely. In the prototype, that girl isn't very overly important to the plot, and in Berserk's earliest imaginings, it seems Griffith as a rival character to Guts didn't exist, at least as much as it does now in the story we hold so dear. So this may be Miura reintroducing that character design again, and maybe using his original outline for that character here, or it could just be him visually referencing his old design. It's really up to you how much you want to read into it. But further, if we run through the cyclical lens of the Berserk world repeating itself, at least in the visual similarities of important players, as we went over earlier with the God Hand members having similarities in the past and present, and assume that it works the same with our beloved trifecta of main characters, and the girl in this cycle is the Griffith, who is the Guts and who is the Casca? We assume Geyserich is the Guts, but he could be the Casca. We are basically strictly talking about visuals here, so Geyserich could have dark skin, or maybe Void does and he's the Casca, though I don't know if I'll necessarily be a fan if Geyserich looks exactly like Guts and Guts is somehow his ancestor and has a claim to Falconia and will be king in the end of the story, or whatever. That could be done well, or it could end up in the pile with Naruto and One Piece, where the heroes secretly were destined to change the world and be the chosen one the entire time. But let's not open that can of worms. If we can go back to the visual parallel point, it would be nice to get some different black male representation in Berserk, by having either Void or Geyserich be black. All the black Berserk fans have right now is a literal child rapist and Boscone, who's cool, but Geyserich and Void are cooler. That is, of course, if we aren't claiming the Kushins as black representation, but rather as Indian representation, though Casca maybe is Kushin, so for the parallel to work either Void or Geyserich would have to be Kushin. I don't know, Berserk has minimal world building. We don't have a world map. Also, back on this page, how Geyserich's eyes are drawn here is particularly masterful, and I love it. All we see is his eyes though, so he could be a black dude. But now let's talk more particularly about this double spread and its implications outside of cyclical parallels. I think it can be assumed even outside of the parallels that this is Geyserich's lover and likely the former queen of Falconia, or whatever it was called under Geyserich's rule. Not the Roman Empire, maybe. She's even reaching out for him in this double spread, which portrays all the heartbreak the quota of a God Hand related event requires. But more notably for us, she is branded on her upper shoulder, meaning she was used as a sacrifice. The blood surrounding the brand and the smeared blood on her arm, hand, neck, face, and cape in the previous shot seems to indicate the branding happened a little while ago. And from the next page, this woman seems to be right on death's door when this memory is set. Geyserich maybe wasn't with her when she got branded, just like Guts wasn't with Casca when she got branded, though I said we were done with the cyclical parallel portion of the analysis here. But if she is branded, then that would indicate that if this is Void's birthing ceremony, that this woman was in some way important to him, which would give us some further insight into Void's character. But then there's also the fact that there's a mountain of branded bodies in the tower shown back in the Golden Age, when this event is first mentioned, meaning that it's likely that Void, or whoever, sacrificed many people just like Griffith did, potentially everybody in the city. God Hand ceremonies may need a collective sacrificial group rather than just one sacrifice like apostles. A rule regarding that has never necessarily been established, which leaves the relationship between Void and this woman ambiguous, whereas this double spread seems to establish that she has a strong connection to Geyserich. We notably don't see a wider shot of her body. She could be missing a leg or even a whole bottom half, Attack on Titan style, that may have caused her imminent demise on the next page. But despite all of this, in this panel explicitly she is reaching up to grab Geyserich, and it's the cutest thing you've ever seen, and that along with the look on her face gives her some intrinsic characterization that only Miura could portray in a single look and gesture. Another interesting thing to consider is whether or not Geyserich also got branded. Skull Knight doesn't seem to be branded, but Skull Knight also seems to just be a spirit or a soul encased in armor. So it would be interesting if Geyserich's body was branded before he lost himself to the Berserker. There's also a lot of implications in this double spread that can be derived from the Queen's outfit. She has all sorts of expensive noblewoman-looking jewelry on, different to the accessories we've seen contemporary noblewomen like Charlotte and the such wearing. This seems again more Romanesque, whereas Charlotte and the such seem more Middle Ages English. But I don't really know the determining factors in those descriptors. Take this pseudo-historical fashion analysis with a grain of salt. Her centerpiece fairy accessory would seem to indicate another thing that's been assumed in the Berserk community for a long time, that Fantasia-type monsters and fairies and magic users mages were all commonplace 1,000 years ago during Geyseric's rule, even in the capital city. He himself is said to have been old friends with Flora, a mage, probably deriving from his human days, meaning a king and a mage being friends may have been more commonplace back then, whereas the king of Midland didn't seem to even understand that magic existed, in the era of the Berserk world we grew up in. Also, Shurikei has mentioned before that in the past mages used to visit villages all the time and treat patients and offer guidance to villagers until the church changed society and pushed them back into the shadows. So it seems the entire Berserk world was once magical and then was slowly pushed out of society, only for us through the story and the actions of Griffith to see it re-emerge in the world. This all plays into that, plus it also seems cyclical. This doesn't really teach us anything, it just shows that while most of the world building has been done in the background of Berserk, it has for the most part been consistent to establish this trend, and I hope it's explored more in the future. But also, because of the fairy iconography on her jewelry, some people speculated that this may be either Flora or Danan themselves. But again, I think this girl dies on the next page, and I definitely don't think it's either one of them. Flora and Skull Knight were said to be old friends, and these two definitely fucked. And I don't see any reason this would be Danan. She's likely always been on Elfhelm. Everybody was shocked that Puck decided to leave, so we've established that the Elfhelm inhabitants don't have much connection with the outside world. Plus, this girl seems to be Skull Knight's primary personal motivation, revenge for this girl in his kingdom. And if she's still alive, then why doesn't he just spend all of his time with her on Elfhelm? Also, there's the whole issue that neither of them seems to have a brand on their shoulder, Danan and Flora that is. Visually, this page is also stunning. It continues the framing motif through Geyseric's eyes, and the detail on this girl and her clothes is outstanding. I still don't know how I feel about Miura's relatively new, as in the last 100 chapters of Berserk, obsession with super filled out lips, but that's besides the point. Then we get another double spread with this woman. As I said, I'm pretty sure she's dead here. Her eyes are no longer in frame, and the motif of seeing through Geyseric's eyes here has narrowed, his vision representing him slowly being lost to the armor, likely because of her death. Also featured heavily in the background is Our Friend, the Brand of Sacrifice, similarly depicted to the way it was at the Tower of Conviction, which would have been a monumental moment not only for Guts and its callbacks, but also for Skull Knight, in that famous moment from the Conviction arc. Also, another parallel here between Guts and Geiseric is that the last thing seared into one of their lost eyes is God Hand-related horror, as the last thing Guts' eyes saw was Casca being raped by Femto, and the last thing Geiseric saw was the death of his love and the destruction of his kingdom, both moments forever etched into their collective memories. I don't know if it's necessarily blood streaming down Geyseric's eye here, or it's just him being pulled into the armor, but the symbolism is the same and it's effective. Presumably Geiseric died after going on a rampage here, destroying his body in the wake of his carnage, as was explained when Guts first put it on. Remember the whole arm being broken back into place thing? Did Geiseric maybe kill the 4 members of the God Hand right here? Maybe that'd be fucking awesome. But more likely he hacked into everything and everyone, as part of the legend is that the Berserker attacked friend and foe alike until he fell himself. The blood memory ends here. After this, Guts is still stunned and confused, which allows Shurikei to calm Guts down, as she always does. Shurikei's daughterly concern for Guts and him having to continually go through this is adorable. She genuinely is terrified by this situation. Guts apologizes for losing control, which wasn't entirely his fault originally, but then he did freak out when seeing the God Hand, and Shurikei tells him not to worry about it because that's her job, which leads to an interesting mini monologue here from Guts, where reflecting on what he just saw, he says that he was sure that was the end, and then is cut off by Skull Knight. I'm sure he was about to say the end of the world, which means that even more so than his previous experiences with the God Hand, this particular instance felt more like the end of the world. Maybe the eclipse felt more like the end of his world, and this one felt more like the end of the world. But then Skull Knight ends the chapter with his monologue explaining that Guts just saw the end of a foolish king and the birth of the Skull Knight. Geiseric clearly regrets his past and doesn't think highly of his past self. Now that we've finished going through the chapter chronologically, there's some other things to talk about. Firstly, the implications of Skull Knight's final monologue here. What was Geiseric's mistake? We've heard before that he was an abusive leader who taxed his population heavily and forced them to construct an immeasurable city that we've seen get repurposed as Falconia. He was probably a hard ass, probably with a good heart, that only those closest to him, probably the Griffith-Girl, ever saw. And then after being humbled by the God Hand, and saved by a combination of the elves and the dwarves it seems, has become more noble of an entity, becoming the Skull Knight and helping Guts, particularly, out along his journey. Maybe the Griffith-Girl is the original Hawk of Light or Falcon of Light, and that's why there's all the pre-built Falcon imagery in Falconia before Griffith rose it from ruin. That would give a contextual reason why she looks just like Griffith and why there's all these references to falcons in the world's scriptures. But this is all very tentative. The final takeaway I've come away from this flashback with is that this has to be a tease for a more fleshed out version of what happened later down the line. This isn't an Attack on Titan chapter 122 situation where the ambiguity is what makes it. The ambiguity here makes the reveal, but there's also plot-relevant, world-building relevant, character-relevant information that can be gleaned from revisiting this down the line, potentially when Skull Knight and Void come face-to-face again. And I hope all of that happens. The last thing I want to sort of briefly touch on that I eventually want to flesh out into a fully fledged video is how well Miura densely handles moment-to-moment interactions between his characters and how it's actually what makes Berserk great. Mainly what I'm talking about in this chapter are the little moments of comedy and characterization with Haina, Gedfring, Morda, and Shurikei. This is also a lesson in density with Miura here, as he fills the page without a single wasted stroke of his pen. It's in these missable little comedy one-liners that Berserk's character writing shines, because they aren't just jokes, they're characterization too. The last chapter was completely built on this sort of character writing with Morda and Shurikei, and I loved it. It was certainly denser than this chapter in terms of content, but the sheer level of excitement from the reveals pushes this chapter slightly ahead in terms of my overall enjoyment. This level of character writing is what makes Berserk great. Let's look at the examples from this chapter. Just Haina recomposing himself when Guts comes back too, and acting like he was always in control of the situation when it clearly got out of his control, is great. It humanizes a character that seemed so prickly and otherworldly last chapter when he was introduced. We don't know next to anything about him yet, but this makes him a character, not just a guy in the story. And the way his pose after the fact to look composed relays all of that to the audience is great. Another example is the quippy back and forth between Morda and Gedfring earlier in the chapter. When Shurikei and Morda show up, Gedfring has a throwaway comedic line about them already cutting classes, which again adds lame comedic humor to Gedfring's characterization and makes him feel more like a person. And Morda's quip later on the same page about the Archmage resorting to torture is great as well. Morda is rebellious and doesn't have much respect for Gedfring, and playfully is playing into that with this side comment. And also this reinforces her characterization as a rebellious mouthy girl who isn't about to be told what to do by some old man, and I'm already in love with her. If you haven't noticed, the only type of character I relate to are mouthy, rebellious, arrogant teenage girls. Asuka is the greatest character of all time and Gabby did nothing wrong, and Morda fits well in this company. Overall, this type of characterization just makes the cast feel more human in a world like Berserk where everyone is some type of magical monstrosity, and that's very important. I can't wait for the boring little dicks to come out talking about how annoying Morda is. You know the type, and I'm already sick of them. But with that mini point about moment-to-moment characterization out of the way, this Berserk chapter review has come to an end. It's horribly late and completely irrelevant by the time you're hearing this, but here it is anyway. Leave a comment about something so I know you are listening. I'm not sure when the next chapter is coming out and which format we will review it in, but we will review it, so stick around to see that. Not much else to say, support links in the description below. Thanks.